European nations face existential dangers. From a lack of preparedness to face an age of strategic power competition, to the intensifying threats from Russia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, North Africa, and China, European leaders must regain their bearings before it is too late. Europe has become sad, gray, and technocratic in essence, losing its inspirational power and risking further disintegration. To put it in simple terms, unless Europeans unite and take decisive action, nation-states risk being overwhelmed by resentment, hatred, and the erosion of freedoms, a crisis comparable to what we may already be witnessing in countries such as the United Kingdom, Ireland, Belgium, and albeit to a lesser degree, France. Good evening, I'm Jonathan Hessen, and this is the 27th edition of TV7 Europa Stands. Joining us to dissect Europe's state of internal and foreign affairs include Professor Miro Kovac, who formerly served as Croatia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and to my left, Professor Jacek Czaputowicz, who formerly served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, and today we are with two diplomats who have plenty of experience also beyond the bounds of their own countries, so it's going to be quite interesting. But let's start with you, Professor Kovac. When we're talking specifically about the internal challenges, last month we had here three distinguished panelists who we're all familiar with, one of whom comes from France, and he highlighted time and again the dangers of the Islamization of Europe, losing the Judeo-Christian essence of the foundation of our continent, of our respective nation states, and governments, instead of dealing with this issue, are shying away, afraid that it will ultimately cost them too much political capital.
So basically, migration and demography are the two main factors for the electoral results we're having in Western Europe. When you compare Eastern Europe and Western Europe, you see a major difference. The societies look different. But things are starting to change under the pressure of migration and demography. The latest example, the UK. So you have a left Democrat, Prime Minister Starmer, who now speaks under the pressure of a so-called blue labor movement inside Labour Party, speaks about migrants who, if they come to the UK, must feel a privilege. So he says it's a privilege as a left Democrat. It's a privilege to be in the UK. So they now understand also in the UK that huge mistakes have been committed in the past and things have to change.
But illegal migration to the UK...
Not only illegal migration, he speaks about migration in general.
Right.
And then you have Tony Blair, also a left Democrat, who is now in business, who published an article on the website of his company, which was reproduced by the Times of London, a conservative daily, who criticized in his article the climate policy of the UK. So, under the pressure of reality, of changing demographics, of the fear of the populations, of electoral results, in some countries, fortunately, things are starting to change. And I can only encourage those governments, those countries which have not yet undergone these changes to start changing. Otherwise, we will lose the European identity of the major countries in Western Europe. Fortunately, we still have a new Europe, as Mr. Rumsfeld called it. But my thesis is the so-called new Europe is the new old Europe, because basically in Central and Eastern Europe, the traditional values and characteristics of Europe have been retained.
Professor Cheputowicz?
Yes, I agree with this assessment, but let me also draw your attention that there were some mistakes made by some European leaders. 2014-15, Chancellor Merkel invited refugees from Syria, from other countries, so they were welcomed. It was a purposeful policy to invite them to Western Europe and then to maybe make a more divergent society. And now we realize that societies, Western societies, also Polish society, do not accept that. We are very much attached to Christian values. We cherish our history, our tradition, and we want to live in the world we like, and not to be forced to change it. So this is a problem, and we can also observe that trend in Poland. Poland is a country which has a border with Belarus and Russia, so we are responsible within the European Union to protect that border. And migrants are used by Vladimir Putin, by Lukashenko, as a tool, as a weapon against Western
Hybrid migration. Right.
Hybrid migration. The pressure is increasing. That's still going on every day. We can read news. They try to pass that border. They come through Poland to Germany, for example, and we have another problem. Germans do not accept that, and they want to send them back to Poland, and there are tensions between countries. So this is a very efficient tool also to create division within the European Union. Yeah, because Germans say, okay, they passed through Poland, and you are obliged to take them back. We don't want, and they don't want to come to Poland again. So I agree, this is a problem. But
is
again,
the Schengen at risk?
Already, yes, I think already we have a border control between Poland and Germany. We criticize that, but that is a policy of already started with Chancellor Scholz, continued by with Chancellor Merz, and even there's a discussion to strengthen that control. Pushbacks on that border from Germany to Poland is on an everyday basis. Thousands yearly. People are not allowed to get in because there are border controls. If they pass, they are sent back through readmission procedure, and it creates a lot of problem with us. So we say in Poland, okay, we did not invite them. You were so open. You encouraged them. You have to take responsibility. We were against from the very beginning. Their argument is, yes, but they went through the territory and there is a law, there is a migration pact, you have to do so. So there are a lot of tension, and of course it was a big mistake to accept it, to take this, to introduce this migration pact, which forces countries to accept some quotas of migrants sent by European Union, it is which breaks solidarity within the European Union.
It's breaking as we speak, and unfortunately, there is a certain sense where people don't realize, and many, particularly on the left-wing bloc, do not comprehend that multi-ethnicity might work, but multiculturalism does not work.
True.
And that is the essence, since ultimately, even Polish culture is different than German culture, and different than Croatian culture, and different than Dutch culture. Of course, there's a certain connection on a European level, but it pretty much stops there. And the European project is not something that was very effective on trying to push that into a new realm altogether. But let's take it one step further. Professor Cheputowicz spoke about this tool that is used by actors such as Russia and Belarus, hybrid migration. Russia used it also here against Finland, our host country, but also we see this utilized by Algiers and Morocco and other countries in North Africa that have exploited the mass migration, also with various criminal organizations, of course. Wherever there is money, the crime also sprouts out. What can you tell us about that, and to what degree are the procedures that the Europeans have done under the latest EU mission, so to speak, also spearheaded in Italy and in Greece, effective?
So when you mentioned culture and multiculturalism, Mr. Merz, when he was still in Parliament 20 years ago, and he was the chairman of the CDU-CSU parliamentary group in the Bundestag, he spoke about the need of a so-called Leitkultur, okay, a major culture in a country which is respected by all the inhabitants, be they ethnic Germans or Germans who have been naturalized. Today, it is accepted, widely accepted, that we need something like that. 20 years ago, it was a scandal. So we need homogeneity in countries. That also applies to the ethnic composition. If there are too many migrants, people get frightened. They think that their privileges will be taken away by these migrants. So people in power have to be clever social engineers. When it comes to controlling migration, of course, controlling the borders is important, okay? So I'm in favor of controlling borders, but it's more or less, it's of symbolic nature. Even now in Germany, if you look at the figures, it's of symbolic nature. What we have to achieve, we have to care about our so-called external security. External security means our security on the borders of the European Union. We need arrangements with Turkey, with other countries. Why do we have today less migrants from Syria? Because of the situation in Syria which has changed, or which is changing right now. So
But shouldn't it be a mutual respect arrangement rather than paying off other countries that are not members of the EU?
So what we need, basically we need a strong European Union which is strong enough to impose things, but also which is strong enough diplomatically to make arrangements. So you need a hard power in Europe. So Europe has to negotiate, has to try to find ways diplomatically to solve problems, but you can only be respected if you have enough hard power. So Europe needs hard power. Not only soft power, hard power means strong military, strong armies, which work together, and also strong police forces in the countries.
Professor Chabutowicz, before we round up this topic specifically, since the external borders is something that also needs to be discussed thoroughly, I'd like to touch on the fact that migration is actually costing money more than it delivers money. These days, we're seeing, of course, a lot of this mantra where you hear politicians speaking about the fact that there are not enough children, so we need more people to come into the market, which ultimately pads up the GDP, so to speak. But what they don't say is that it's not the GDP that actually makes a country richer, but actually the GDP per capita. And therefore, despite seeing, for instance, a person entering with a certain income value, many of the brains of those respective countries, particularly also in the West, are deciding to relocate elsewhere, to include the United States, Canada, Australia, and other locations, and are freeing up place for 10 people who would make that same salary as that one individual leaving. So it seems like there is here a complex issue with costs of living rising across Europe and much impact going to ultimately foster new problems that will then challenge governments a lot more in the future.
No, yes, I agree. It's a very complex issue, but we can criticize European Union for migration policy, at least it's Poland's position. I agree with Miro, who said that it is necessary to have a united Europe, strong power to keep migrants outside Europe. The problem is that we see it differently. European Union wants to impose on other countries some policies. For example, they want to impose on Poland to accept quotas of migrants. We don't know them, we are not responsible for them, and we suspect that they want to change our ethnic composition, so to say, and break our, so to say, sovereignty. And the problem with the European Union is that its energy goes into internal issues to somehow centralize the power within the European Union, but to break resistance of other countries. So this is a problem. But there is also another, referring to your example, I agree with them that the migrants can create a problem, but we profit a lot in Poland from migration from Ukraine, because we can count how much they contribute to our GDP, they pay taxes, and how much they receive. So we have problems, demographical problems. Ukrainians are close to us in terms of ethnicity, not so much culture. They are Orthodox, we are Catholics, and there are some tensions. But I think that you can imagine a policy, migratory policy, which contributes to the development of a country, like the Poles who contributed to the development of UK after we joined the European Union. That time UK was in the European Union, but one of the reasons they decided to leave was maybe too much people from Poland. So sometimes it's very difficult, but every politician in UK agrees with me that with that opinion that our contribution of Poles working there 15 years ago contributed a lot to the development. But at the same time, they admit that, okay, but our citizens were against. There were too many Poles. They took our works, places of work. So complicated. I think politicians should be very honest vis-à-vis society, shows them pros and cons openly.
So what Jacek said, if I may add, about the differences between the western part of Europe and the eastern part of Europe. We need more tolerance when it comes to the western part of Europe. The idea is basically that there's a tendency to impose the way of thinking of people who are in Berlin or in Paris or somewhere else on people in power in the so-called new old Europe. But if there is a different tradition in Poland or in Hungary or in Czech Republic or in Croatia, why not respect it? We have a different approach, we have a different tradition, it should be respected.
Well, when it comes down to it, and if I may close this topic so we move to the next one, politicians must be in tune with societies and their respective societies. It's not on the European level, it is on the local level, and I am of the opinion that the European institutions, and institutions anywhere, should not meddle in the affairs of sovereign nations. And that is something that will ultimately be the fraction that will trigger the downfall of the European Union if it does not take this into account.
We need reform. The European Union needs reform.
Absolutely. Well, Eastern Europe seeks reform for the European Union. Many in Western Europe seek the downfall of the European Union, and there is also no agreement on this aspect anymore. But I do agree that reform is required also to deal with the high levels of corruption that have been unveiled in recent years and that really need to be tackled. But you spoke about external borders, the challenges that Europe is facing. The main challenge obviously comes right now from two main locations, namely the Eastern Front with a raging war between Russia and Ukraine, and the Southern Front, the Mediterranean, so to speak, vis-a-vis the Middle East and North Africa. Much crime coming out of the South, again, going down to migration, but let's talk about security-related matters. Those countries, going from Libya to Algiers to other countries in the vicinity, are faced with high crime levels and very dangerous Islamist terror groups operating in this vicinity with malign intentions towards the north.
That's why I said we have to take external security very seriously. External security means security basically vis-à-vis Russia, Belarus, and of course the southern border. We have to be very, very vigilant and very effective. That's why I said we need strong hard power, we need hard power. We can only impose things, we can only find solutions if we have enough hard power.
But if you look at operations such as Irini, which was a naval operation of the European Union, many countries contributed types of vessels to that operation to try and block the various groups operating out of Libya. It was, and still is, a failure in my opinion, since it doesn't really deal with the root cause of the issues. So how do we see this change?
If you look at the Red Sea, we cannot operate without the Americans.
Why not?
Because we're not strong enough. That's why I'm saying we need hard power. We have to be much stronger together. We have to be taken seriously. Now we are speaking about what to do, what we have to do to become more serious, and that's the right approach. I'm in favor of negotiations also when it comes to resolving the conflict in Ukraine after the Russian invasion. But we can only negotiate with the Russians if we are taken seriously by the Russians. If we are weak, we'll not be taken seriously by them. So we need we need hard power.
Well, Croatia, of course, just renewed its fleet recently and modernized its fleet to the point where it could potentially contribute more in the various waterways, particularly, and that is one point that also needs to be highlighted. But Professor Czaputowicz, Poland is right now the most, or the largest recipient of funds from the European institution for its strong power. Roughly 300 billion euros have been invested into Poland's military and defense establishment. And yet, it seems like there's somewhat frustration in neighboring countries over this move at a time when we do see, of course, the Germans taking care of their own and the Netherlands and other countries still trying to invest to keep up. But nonetheless, it seems like the Europe that we know is starting to shift its power balance.
Okay, interesting. But I agree with, and of course it's obvious that everybody knows that Poland invests a lot, first of all, from our own budget, close to 5% GDP. So we are a model for other countries and set as such a model by the United States, for example. That's a good example. Why we do so? Because we are close to Russia. We are afraid of their policy, imperialistic policy, war in Ukraine. And so it is the reason, and we will continue that. Very important that other countries will take also into consideration that threat and invest more in military development, military power. But next years, Europe will not be sustainable in terms of defense and guaranteeing its security. We have to rely on the United States. Therefore, we have to maintain good relations with the UK and, in the meantime, build our defense industry, military capacity within the European Union. This is the only way, I agree. This is the only way to become secure and independent militarily. Also, I think that there's a need of a mental change in the leadership of the European Union, because we were somehow educated that somebody took care of our security. We had the security umbrella from the United States. I am not sure if our leaders are prepared to take that responsibility.
You're talking here about education, which is very, very important. Can you expand on that?
Yes, I'm talking about, because one thing is investment, armament, another thing is willingness to fight, to defend your country, and take a risk and sacrifice your life. So, and this is a weakness of democracy sometimes, and liberal democracy when there is a unity of a country. And authoritarian regimes like the Russian ones has advantage because there's no discussion and there's a centralized power and go to the army and you go. There's no question. When you ask people in Western Europe, young men, are they ready to sacrifice their life? I'm not so certain. According to opinion polls, it's a problem with that. So, complicated situation, but we have to adapt to that. And we have to also appreciate and support Ukraine, which gives us time to prepare, and they fight for us to a certain extent. That's how it is assessed, that Vladimir Putin will continue that war. It's very difficult to stop. When you start a war, your economy is set on that. You have to pedal so as not to fall. So this is the problem, that you have already a dynamic, and according to different intelligence sources, it might be continued. Therefore, our reaction should be decisive, strong, and we have to be united.
Absolutely. Well, at a time when, and here I will take from what Professor Chaputowicz just said, the intelligence communities do believe that Russia will not stop with Ukraine. It will move further eastward. The first ones to bear the brunt are going to be countries in the Eastern Bloc, which both of you come from. And therefore, when we really look at the broad challenge, why is the European Union and the various member states so focused on infrastructure of long-term investments rather than immediate goals to modernize the military at hand for some tools that will provide not only a fighting chance, but also a actual deterrent against a possible invasion?
So first of all, when it comes to our American partners, the Americans will not forget Europe. The Americans used to have as the most important region to them Europe, then the Pacific region, and then the Near East, the Middle East. Today, things have changed. Number one is the Pacific region, so Southeast Asia is number one for the States. Then comes Europe, and then the Near East, the Middle East. Okay. So even if we wanted to get rid of the Americans, which we, especially in Eastern Europe, do not want, it wouldn't work. What the Americans want basically is the following thing. They want us to do more. So they would surveil, supervise things in Europe, and intervene if necessary. But basically they want us to do the job when it comes to European security in cooperation with them. They will never let us do it only alone. Why? Because they have strategic interests.
A couple of weeks ago, I was in Washington and I had a panel for a program I do, Deep Dive with Hudson Institute, during the course of which I interviewed the president and CEO of Hudson Institute, Mr. John Walters, during the course of which he said, quite frankly, if I was Xi Jinping, the president of China, I would pay Putin to bog the United States down in Europe, force it to deploy the 200,000 troops, and that comes, of course, at the expense of American capacity to project power both in the Pacific as well as in the Middle East. So looking at it from a broad term or from a broader perspective, it seems like the Americans are trying to reinvigorate that necessity within the leadership to understand you need to prepare your people to sacrifice and to really make the next step towards that direction.
Yes, so that's why I said in this show some months ago that the Americans under Trump, and now they're doing it, would shift towards cooperation with Russia. Because of the need to focus on the Pacific region. But the biggest challenge for us and for the Americans is to recreate an industrial basis which would allow us to have a strong defense industry and strong armies. The Americans right now, that's the biggest challenge. How to reindustrialize the United States and how to create a basis for a strong defense industry. Look at what the Russians are doing. They're producing much more weapons, much more ammunition than the whole West together. Much more drones. So the Americans right now, they have a huge program how to recreate a strong industrial basis and how to recreate a strong defense industry. And we will do the same. So the situation right now, this new constellation, the US and Russia trying to have a modus vivendi, to work together, will make us much more responsible and will push us, the Europeans, to recreate ourselves, our industrial basis for having a strong defense industry, to feel much more in charge and to be much more in charge. Because the real threat for us, be we Americans, Poles, Croats, Dutch, is our model. The Chinese are very ambitious, and the only country which has the capacity and the ambition to substitute the Americans in world politics as the major power are the Chinese, because they think that their model, society model, is more efficient than the Western model. So we have to stick together. There will always be differences between the Americans and the Europeans because they're also logically different interests. But when it comes to upholding our model, we have to stick together, we have to work together, because the real threat to our model is not in Russia, because the Russians are not strong enough. They may launch a new attack against a smaller country in the Baltics. We have to be prepared in NATO to fight against it or to contain Russia. But Russia is not strong enough, nor does it have the ambition to impose its model on the world. The only country which can do that and which has the ambition is China.
Yes, but Russia is self-sustainable and Russia is not. So there are different schools of thought.
We have made many mistakes when it comes to Russia. So we are. There was a study which was published some weeks ago by the National Bank of Finland, the Bank of Finland. So it's the Central Bank of Finland. A study about the well-being in Russia. How people feel their well-being in Russia today. And basically the result is, it's a longitudinal study, that the Russians have the impression that they are better off today than before the invasion of Ukraine. That's a study conducted by the Bank of Finland, not by the Bank of Belarus or by the Russian Central Bank. No, it's a Finnish study. So we have to understand that our approach thus far hasn't been the right one.
Right. Well, the United States,
We did not contain Russia. We did not contain Russia. Russia launched a second invasion. The Russians occupied 20% of the territory. We have not sent forces to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians cannot alone. They're not capable to liberate the occupied territories. These are the facts.
These are facts. However, I do give Ukraine more credit.
The Ukrainians fought courageously, and they have to be complimented for that. But basically, they're on their own. We're helping them with money, with weapons, but they're on their own.
Indeed. Well, Professor Chaputovich, what is your take on that? Particularly also, let's focus first on the Russian front. Russia has sustained some very devastating blows to its strategic capabilities, particularly also with the drone operations in asymmetric warfare, where the intelligence community in Ukraine managed to really penetrate Russian territory and destroy over 20-some or 30-some, the numbers of course vary, depends who you ask, of their strategic bombers. All the while, we do see indeed in Ukraine proper, there is a certain stagnation at this point in time with no real capacity to maneuver, not on the Russian side of the equation, but also not on the Ukrainian side of the equation. Are we going to see more of the same?
It's a very interesting development. It was a blow also on Russian military power, these aircrafts you mentioned, but also to prestige, self-esteem of Vladimir Putin and Russia. So it was very symbolic, important gesture, act, as well as attack on this Kerch bridge, which is also a symbolic bridge between the Russian mainland and Crimea region. But these are symbolic acts. I think also about and we have to think, and also military community observes that conflict, how it changes, how war changes, what instruments are used, what weapon is important and decisive. It's very interesting to observe. It's difficult to predict what will be the development in the future, but definitely Vladimir Putin doesn't want to accept unconditional ceasefire. It means that he thinks he's on a winning position. Definitely, Russia is superior to Ukraine in terms of manpower, GDP, strength of the army. So the only way to continue that conflict, not to lose ground to the Russians, is support from the United States and the European Union, from the West. So we have to continue. We have to mobilize ourselves and sacrifice also sometimes, support them militarily, financially, to produce munition stuff. It is costly for society, and people don't want to do it any longer, but it is the only way, and it is also the chance for Russia that we will end that support. There is a pressure. It's a difficult situation, difficult to predict, but I'm not optimistic about the development. We'll see what will happen, what decisions will be taken at the NATO summit in 2 weeks' time. We know very well that President Donald Trump does not want to continue that unconditional support for Ukrainians, and hopefully the Europeans will take that burden and continue supporting Ukraine.
Indeed, the next NATO summit, of course, in The Hague. But nonetheless, when you're talking specifically about the complexity of the Eastern Front, there is a distinct difference, and that is also something that Professor Kovac just insinuated. On the one hand, we have Ukraine that does not receive the manpower to sustain the various fronts that it's currently engaged with, all the while the Russians are in a relationship with other totalitarian regimes that are more than happy to sell them mercenaries, namely North Korea, Iran, the various proxies that Iranians used to have and now are tattering all over, China. They're all sending troops and munitions to try and sustain Russia, which is not having an easy time itself. So the question is, to what degree can we learn from this, and what should be reevaluated in this context? I'd like to hear both of you on this.
I think that it's difficult to expect that Western countries will send their troops to fight. There is a discussion, if there is an agreement reached between the two countries, Ukraine and Russia, under the umbrella of the United States, it might be a stabilization force set up by the French, the Brits, and other countries. It is possible, but it is kind of in a peacetime. Simply, societies and countries are not ready to take a risk and to be involved in the war, because there's one important difference between Ukraine and Russia. Russia is a nuclear power, and the threat from Russia is very serious. Therefore, countries together with Russia don't take that risk.
Yeah, but we see that both the Americans, particularly the Americans, have provided a strategic umbrella of nuclear power to the Ukraine. And if it didn't, Russia would have used nuclear power a long time ago. So it seems that the American deterrent is working when we're talking about nuclear capabilities, to include also that of France and the United Kingdom, two additional European actors that are nuclear
One important issue happened because, okay, if there is a United States involved, I think more countries would join that. But there's a different situation when President Donald Trump says, okay, the European countries will take responsibility for this ceasefire, but we will be not joining you. You're right. American umbrella is very important, crucial. Has been and will be. But the problem is that the Americans don't want to guarantee that security for these countries. So this is.
But why would the United States send troops if Poland doesn't want to send troops?
No, I think that in Poland there is a discussion about that issue, and we said openly that we will not join European troops because we are too close, our responsibilities are different, and we risk much more because it's our neighbor. They will not attack Paris, they will attack first Warsaw, the Russians. But if there is a case, we are a very close ally of the United States, if there is a case, okay, the Americans will take lead in this stabilization forces, our calculation would have been different.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I just don't see the Americans committing boots on the ground.
No, they will not do it, but
therefore we are not. Therefore we are not.
This is the fundamental issue, and we were talking about it quite plainly. West Europe will not commit troops when they say, okay, the first line, so to speak, namely Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and others, do not commit troops. So why should Western Europe commit troops when they are behind you, so to speak? This is the way they look at it in the West. So in the United States, they won't do it because they say we have to deal with China in the event that they launch something on Taiwan. Professor Kovac?
So I will repeat what I have been saying since 2015, basically. We should have the West, the partners of Ukraine, on the request of Ukraine, we should have sent peacekeeping forces in 2015. And at that time, the Russians would not have intervened, nor would they have launched a second invasion.
Yeah, but we're wise in retrospect.
Okay, now it's too late. I said it in Washington during a conference in 2015, I said, we have to send forces. We didn't do it, okay? Today, what is going on in Ukraine? Who has the air sovereignty? The Russians. You cannot travel to Kiev on a plane. You need to use the train. And theoretically, the Russians could bombard the trains driving to Kiev. They're not doing it, by the way. So, look, Mr. Rubio, the state secretary, he said 2 months ago openly in an interview, also in Congress, it is a proxy war. And it is a proxy war between the West, the Americans, us, and Russia. Okay? And now we have also the Chinese and the Koreans, the Iranians helping the Russians, sending them weapons, and so on and so forth. So, how do the Americans see things? They tried, Mr. Biden said in an interview recently to Le Monde, not Biden, Lula, the Brazilian president, he said about Biden, whom he had talked to, that his objective was to, I quote him, to destroy Russia. It didn't work out, okay? Russia's still there, and I told you about this study from the National Bank of Finland. Okay, but basically...
I wouldn't take Lula, and I get your point, but I wouldn't take Lula at his word and nothing.
I'm just quoting Lula.
Right.
Okay, good. But basically, the Americans have achieved their goal. And what is the goal? The frontier of the West has been pushed eastwards. And now 80% of Ukraine is not controlled anymore, influenced by Russia. 20% of the territory is controlled, of Ukraine is controlled by Russia. But 80% is basically free. So we have to see things differently, and the Ukrainians do not have the obligation to accept, to recognize that these 20% of the territory of Ukraine is Russian.
So you're saying, in other words,
it's a huge victory.
To accept it in the same fashion that Cyprus accepted Turkish occupation of its northern part.
For instance, meaning that the Ukraine does not need to recognize it as formal Russian territory. But right now, take what Jacek said, take into consideration that Russia is the biggest neighbor of Ukraine, not Croatia, not Hungary, not the Netherlands, Russia, a nuclear power, whom the Americans need for running things in the world, not only vis-à-vis China, also in Greenland and other things. It's already a huge success.
Thank you, Miro, and it's indeed very important. I will like to redivert our attention now just for a moment to the Middle East for a couple of minutes to give a little bit of insight to all of our viewers at home, since, of course, as we all are aware, and the situation is still very fluid and developing since Thursday. Overnight, there was a very concrete, intelligence-driven strike by the Israeli Air Force alongside the various branches of Israel's intelligence community and other security arms against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. This strike came as a surprise to many, not to the Americans, believe it or not. It was actually fully coordinated with the Trump administration. There were vigorous discussions behind closed doors, and naturally, Israel would not have conducted this strike without getting the green light from the Trump administration. So there was a lot of chatter going on, of course, during those several hours. There was a lot of deception within the context of warfare, which is very common of militaries to conduct and governments to conduct. As the old philosopher once said, Sun Tzu, the essence of war is basically deception. War is the equivalent of deception, so to speak. But nonetheless, to give you a little bit of a background to the way the things evolved, I think it's important to get some context, since it does also impact the European continent. Particularly also France and Britain came immediately out and declared support for the state of Israel, and also material support, so including their air forces to partake in a vigorous campaign against Iran's aggression against the state of Israel, their steadfast commitment to ensure that the Islamic Republic of Iran does not attain nuclear weapon capabilities. And last week, during the Board of Governors meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the nuclear agency or watchdog, so to speak, of the United Nations, the United States, alongside France, Britain, and Germany, managed to guarantee a censor, as we also mentioned on our TV7 Israel news bulletin. During the censor, we had 19 voting in favor, 11 abstentions, and only 3 against, to include amongst them also Russia and China, of course, that were opposing to the censor. And the United States was starting to apply pressure on the E3, but specifically on France and the United Kingdom, to snap back sanctions against the Islamic Republic. The censor is still going to be diverted to the UN Security Council where a meeting will be held and a resolution to this issue can be brought forth when either France or Britain decide to do so. Beyond that, there is another very important element that occurred in the lead up to the decision by the Israelis to launch the strike in full coordination, again, with the United States of America, and that was a very simple fact. The Trump administration was looking to negotiate with the Iranians in good faith, and the Iranians were just not there. So the Americans suggested to meet on Sunday, today namely, in order to reach a certain breakthrough. Unfortunately, the Iranians continued to live in a certain delusional world where they thought they could persist with their nuclear enrichment and not deal with consequences thereof. The Trump administration continued to convince the Iranians, or attempted to convince the Iranians, to shift course. And the moment President Trump realized, actually, that was last Tuesday, when during a meeting he said that he thought initially that there was some hope for talks to yield some sort of fruit, he increasingly became more aware that the Iranians were just dragging their feet and not really keen on a negotiated solution. And while that was happening, the intelligence community in Israel, in coordination also with other Western intelligence agencies, namely the Five Eyes and others, they had concrete evidence that the Iranians had a number of meetings during the course of which they were preparing breakout towards a nuclear device, something the state of Israel cannot afford, nor the international community at that, since if the Iranians were to acquire nuclear weapon capabilities, it would not only threaten Israel, but the entire Gulf region. It would threaten also the entire world and the Non-Proliferation Treaty as we know it, because this would ultimately have led to many countries around the world considering to break out themselves to nuclear weapons. And that is something that we do not want to see happen, to say the least. We hope for less nuclear weapons around the world, not more, and that is an understatement. But therefore, the Security Cabinet in Jerusalem met on the 12th of June, just last Wednesday evening at 8 p.m., during the course of which meeting started. They also had the opportunity to read from the Bible together and pray for the well-being of Israel's security establishment and defense forces, as well as of their partners and allies in various formats. Then, subsequently, at roughly 3 o'clock a.m., the attacks began, full-scale aerial campaign alongside multiple ground operations, intelligence operations, and from that moment onwards, of course, we will discuss this more at length also during our Israel programming at TV7 Israel News. So stay tuned for that tomorrow and in the days ahead. But we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have another minute and a half. You, of course, had elections in Poland with a new president. It's going to cripple Donald Tusk to a large extent, something that, of course, puts a smile on the Law and Justice Party, but nonetheless, it does put Poland in a precarious situation. On a broader term, also, if you can give us 2 cents.
It was important because we have a perspective. We know what to expect in the future, so we'll continue our conservative way of development. I must also underline that candidate, President Karol Nawrocki, was received by President Donald Trump before the election, and they already talked after the election. It means that our relations with the United States will improve, probably. We will cooperate closely, which is very good news. On the other hand, within the European Union, it is a disappointment because they thought that the government of Donald Tusk will be closer to the mainstream of European Union policy. Also,
which is not the case.
in terms of at least values, liberal values, they are much closer to mainstream than president. But we will focus first, NATO summit in The Hague. Second, I think very important, how the issue between European Union and the United States regarding the tariffs will be resolved. And then if we can build on that partnership in the future. There is a chance that we will have good relations, European Union and the United States.
We'll have to find out,
Yes.
Professor Kovac.
Yes, so the major process going on is the strategic competition between the US and China. So China has become very strong. The rise of China is the result of serious planning and also of delocalization. So producing not in Germany, not in the Netherlands, not in the US, but in Southeast Asia. So the Americans have now understood that they have to recreate a strong industrial basis to have a competitive defense industry. That also implies for us in Europe that we have to recreate a strong industrial basis in our countries to be able ourselves to have strong defense industries. We need strong militaries, and we need common sense policies. We need societies which are homogeneous, and we should work on rejuvenating Europe, bringing it back to the traditional values. And I'll quote once again, or say once again what the Brits are doing. Left Democrats in Great Britain are now speaking about traditional family values, veneering the homeland, speaking about family. That's the only way. And saying that you come to the UK, it's a privilege.
Well, they're doing that while repressing also quite vigorously any voice against them, which is also a point.
That has to change too.
That is a sense of the radical left.
There Mr. J.D. Vance was right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
so no decadence anymore and no wokeism stuff because it kills societies.
It does. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. Professor Jacek Czaputowicz and Professor Miro Kovac, thank you so very much for all of your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Helsinki, Finland, have a good evening. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.